All right. While you're putting your names in the chat, we'll get started with just some logistics and a welcome. But thank you everybody for being here today, and thank you for tuning in to our Moose Family Speaker Series today. We're really happy you're here. I'm Michelle Stockness. I'm the Executive Director of Freshwater. My background is that I'm a civil engineer who focused on sustainable water use and drinking water for the past 20 years. And now I've been at Freshwater for 1 year as of this month. So happy to be here. And Freshwater is focusing on circular water strategies in Minnesota. I'll flash the page of who we are right now. But we really think water reuse, circular water, groundwater recharge are things that we should be looking into more as a state and a region. So we're here to talk about sustainable water uses. So that's why we have this topic for our speaker series today. Some logistics before we get started too. We expect a decent number of folks streaming in from around the region. So you can see you're already doing it. Please use your chat and tell us who you are, where you're streaming from. This chat will also, and your organization will be helpful. This chat will also help. We'll be doing questions. Sometimes there's a Q&A and there's a chat. We're just going to use the chat only. So if you have questions, you can add them at any time throughout the webinar. I'm doing a little introduction. Shannon's going to talk for about a half an hour, and then we'll have around 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So we'd love to hear your questions and comments as they come up. So add those to the chat at any time. Some of the logistics today, let's see. When you do the chat too, make sure it goes to everyone. I think you know that with the drop down thing. And then we've also turned on the closed captioning, and you can hide that by clicking on the live transcript button. I think that's all the logistics that I can think of now, but put in the chat if you need any help otherwise. And back to our main event. So it's our pleasure to have Freshwater host the Moose Family Speaker Series on water resources. This lecture series is named after the late Malcolm Moos, who was president of the University of Minnesota from 1967 to 1974. And Freshwater and the College of Biological Sciences at the university have partnered together for years to bring cutting-edge science on water from around the world and nationally to new audiences. And we are very grateful for the partnership with the College of Biological Sciences. So please help me, join me in welcoming Shannon Spurlock to the webinar today. Shannon I'll read your bio, Shannon, and then you can fill in what we haven't talked about yet. Shannon joined the Pacific Institute in 2022 as a senior researcher in public policy and practice uptake. She develops and implements strategies for advancing policies and practices on priority topics for the organization, with a focus on scaling the integration of approaches with multiple benefits into public policy and planning. Prior to joining the Pacific Institute, Shannon ran a consulting business where her projects included researching interagency collaboration among water utilities for the purpose of scaling water reuse and overseeing the development of a web-based tool that compared ratepayers' water rates across regions and utilities for the purpose of demonstrating affordability or the lack thereof. Additionally, Shannon has led extensive community-driven food systems experience and has led policy change at the local and the state level. Shannon holds a bachelor's from the University of Colorado Boulder and a master of nonprofit management from Regis University. So you can see why we've invited Shannon here. She's really got great national expertise in water reuse and circular water economy, and does a lot of work nationally from all over the country. So we're really glad to have you here, Shannon. And with that, I will turn it over to you and let you share the screen. And as Shannon's talking, please add your questions into the chat, and we'll do a Q&A at the end for about 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And it is such a pleasure to be joining all of you today. I'm going to begin sharing the screen and hope that this just goes very smoothly. There we go. Perfect. Yes. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. And again, it's a pleasure to be with all of you here today and to talk about reuse, stormwater capture and use, opportunities to advance water resilience through these strategies, and what that can mean for the state of Minnesota and everything from the development of alternative water supplies including groundwater recharge, manage aquifer recharge, and give different examples of what that looks like in different regions, and also to highlight some of the work going on in your backyard, which is really exciting. So as Michelle hinted at in that bio, my background, actually it got to it a little bit, but I came into water through food systems. And I actually really, it was a circuitous path. It was not direct to water, but I started working in water to think in the state of Colorado to think about how can we access a reliable, sustainable irrigation source for food crops. And so started working and building coalitions across the state to support the expansion of the allowed end uses for recycled water. And so in that, I started working, my first kind of foot in the door for water was reuse, and agricultural reuse still holds a very near and dear place in my heart. And the thing that I love actually with food and water is that they are both necessary for our survival. And I would actually say more so than survival, that is really kind of like that bottom bar. But in order to thrive, how do we create, food systems and water resilience for everyone so that we can have the best communities to live, work, play in, thriving communities. So I really do love this area of work. There's a term called a permanent whitewater, and it was developed, kind of say like around 2010 or so. But it really, what it looks at, and I actually love that it's a water-based metaphor, but a permanent whitewater means that there is no normalcy. Then, our norm is that things are, our times, our environment, they're unpredictable, and we have to plan for those. We have to be ready in the case of water, from droughts to floods to wildfire. And how do we develop water systems that actually help us thrive in unpredictable times during permanent whitewater? And that actually is where, the topic of water reuse, stormwater capture and reuse, I think come into play really strongly for me. They are such flexible strategies that really can be adapted to any region of the country, whether you're water rich, water scarce. They each serve purposes, everything from building up a water supply to nutrient management to just overall water resilience as it relates to different sectors, agricultural, industrial, municipal. And so I think they're really exciting opportunities to think about the development of water reuse, including stormwater capture and reuse, to really advance resilience. Earlier this year, the Pacific Institute, in partnership with Second Nature, conducted a national assessment that looked at the potential of stormwater runoff across the country. And we were advised, we had an advisory group, an incredible panel, including several people from the state of Minnesota and who have worked in Minnesota, really inform about how we were measuring things, considerations, and the metrics that we should be using to understand this potential. And so within this, you can see that study, and actually I should have added a link to this slide, and I've never thought about that before. I can add that into the chat later. But the national stormwater runoff potential across the United States is 59.5 million acre feet per year. And so I'll put a few parameters in that. One, it's a tremendous opportunity. And we're saying this is your big picture number across the United States. We acknowledge that not every drop of water can be captured and reused, and actually nor should it. But this is really a snapshot of that overall potential across the United States. And so Minnesota, typically being a water-rich state, and actually given a lot of the flooding that you have coming on recent, and I think your Minnesota and Mississippi rivers are set to crest this weekend, at around, like, I want to say 20 feet above is what I'm recalling. But anyway, so it's particularly timely to think about when we do have stormwater, when we have flooding, how can we actually look at turning what can be dangerous and detrimental into an asset? And so that actually is part of the shifting national paradigm that says, once these stormwater, municipal wastewater, something to be disposed of, to get off site, to get away from us. But let's rethink that. We have assets right in front of us that we can use to create stronger communities, more vibrant communities, more resilient communities. And so this shifting of paradigms is really demonstrated. We have a couple of national examples here that I really love because one, they are national. And one is with the Water Reuse Action Plan. And many of you may be familiar with this, but the Water Reuse Action Plan is a federally integrated partnership-based effort that looks to scale reuse across the United States. And it really looks at reuse through a number of different buckets, everything from innovation and technology to water quality to policy, and really says, well, how do we understand the role of reuse? What do we need to dig into and find out more to scale it? And what are the barriers that we need to recognize and potentially remove in order to do this? And so the Water Reuse Action Plan is comprised of a number of actions that fall into the buckets that I just referenced. And so as we talk about state policies or regulations, legislation that may be in place, the Water Reuse Explorer, and they have an online platform, Action 2.1 and 3.1, really, they did a national scan to look what each state was doing, what were their specifications, what were the policies and regulations that each were beholden to. And it's an excellent database to understand what's being done what's required in your own backyard, in your own state, and also what is maybe your neighboring states or within existing other regions that share similar characteristics or differing characteristics. So I want to point those out as resources. And then also looking at a few other actions here I wanted to highlight that look at this shifting paradigm of stormwater capture and reuse from a nuisance to an asset. And so a really groundbreaking piece of research led by my colleague, Dave Smith, among others who may be on the call today that informed that. It was called the Pure Potential, and really looked at these national opportunities and what can stormwater, the capture and reuse of stormwater, mean for increasing reliable water supplies across the United States. The Pacific Institute is leading actions 5.5 and 5.8. And in those actions, I talked about the national potential for stormwater capture and use, and we're about to kick off action 5.5, includes the reuse as well. And that also, that includes a national assessment. I'm so sorry. One moment. Bad timing for people coming by. So 5.5 also looks at a national assessment for the potential for reuse. And so what is not currently being reused and what could we reuse? And so that will be in partnership with the Water Reuse Association. And then finally, action 5.8 really looks at I feel like if things can be done in Colorado, they can be done anywhere, given our restrictive water rights environment. And so really, let's look at stormwater capture and use in Colorado. How and when can you do it? What are the conditions and what are the opportunities? So really just to talk about this elevation of water reuse, stormwater capture and use, and a recognition of the needs that it can fulfill at the local municipal watershed level, even state level. So, and then, so with that, one thing I constantly think about is the why behind things. Why does it make a difference if we recycle water? Why does it make a difference if we treat municipal wastewater so it can be fit for a better and higher use rather than just discharge? And so something that some of you may work with in the public health realm, maybe you may be familiar with what's called the social determinants of health. And the CDC has 5 that they highlight. And for me, I would say these are very important drivers about that make a difference to me about why I do what I do and why water and food are so important. Because when we advance, I'll talk about water reuse specifically, we can talk about how do we actually promote economic stability? How do we promote education, access, and quality, neighborhood and built environment, and social and community context? So really quick here, the social determinants of health are defined as the factors that contribute to our individual health outside of the doctor's office. And depending on what you're reading, anywhere from like 80 to, I think the general number used is 85% of our health is determined outside the doctor's office, right? So economic stability, meaning like, let's look at eliminating poverty. What does it mean to have, how does water relate to that? How does reuse relate to that? And we'll hit a little bit more on that. I'm gonna highlight one of the projects in your backyard and talk about the role of Towerside Innovation District and how that contributes to that. But thinking about with reuse, you have a local water supply that you can control the costs, the treatments, the inputs and the outputs more. And so therefore that cost remains steadier, and increases then are not as frequent and do not have to be passed on to ratepayers or end users nearly as frequently as relying on outside or imported sources of water. I'm going to give an example with education access and quality out of California to highlight that piece right there. In LA County, they have something called Measure W, which is a funding mechanism called the Safe Clean Water Program. And it's a parcel tax. And one school, Jackson Elementary, applied for funding in partnership with a community-based organization, Amigos de los Rios, and they were awarded funding to look at capturing stormwater. Actually, I'll say to change their school environment, remove the asphalt, green it, add trees, I would say nature-based solutions, nature-based stormwater management elements. And in that, they decreased the element, decreased the urban heat island effect, created an outdoor play environment for its students during the day and the families that live in the area, that's the only green space and outdoor space for many of those family members to gather. And for me, the crowning piece of this example is that in Los Angeles, there are days that are so hot that the kids are not allowed to go outside. And when you have environments, highly urbanized environments that are predominantly asphalt, that is intensified. And you can't have ready learners when they don't get a break during the day to exercise, to burn off steam, to be kids. And so in this way, stormwater capture and use is directly impacting the quality of their education by helping create those green spaces where they can go out, burn off energy, and return to the classroom ready to learn. I think all of you are experiencing the flooding of the rivers, and the neighborhood and built environment context really kind of also rises to the top as how the social determinants of health can be impacted or mitigated through stormwater capture and use, municipal wastewater use, and reuse can really help advance public health in these realms. So one thing Michelle talked about also in the introduction is kind of my focus on multiple benefits. And how do we think about that when we think about the uptake and the practice of including maybe stormwater capture and use into water supply planning or reuse, right? That it goes beyond water quality or water supply, but also providing social services, community-based services that otherwise may not exist without that reliable water supply. But these are some of the things to think about with multiple benefits. There are trade-offs, and there are considerations. So for example, when you think about water management strategies such as municipal water reuse, even decentralized reuse, which I know actually the Twin Cities has a number of examples of, and also stormwater capture and use, understanding the multiple benefit trade-offs here. Some of the things that I really like about the consideration of multiple benefits when looking at the adoption and advancement of reuse is that it's a holistic approach. And it also looks at the end user and who the beneficiaries are. So a multiple benefit approach ideally is community driven. And we can even talk about that a little more when we talk about some of the examples within Minnesota and nationally. But what happens is that if you're working with a community and you're looking at, for example, stormwater capture and use, I'll go back to the school example. You can hear the community might not say it's important for us to have better stormwater management. That's not the regular language of community member, but they can say things like, it's really hard to get to work when it floods. It's so hot outside. It worries me that my child has to stay inside all day, and I worry about the quality of their education. Or we live in an area where we keep hearing that water is so stressed and that at some point our drinking water supplies will be threatened. I mean, there are things that people hear about and they can express. And so when you think about the role of stormwater capture and use and water recycling, think about also what are the ways, the variety of community challenges that these can also help address. When you think about the reuse of stormwater, for example, you can think about nature-based solutions, creating, I'm just riffing a little bit with the multiple benefits right here, but there's so many examples, right, of looking at creating green spaces within a community through a wetland that is designed to capture the water, treat the water, but at the same time is creating outdoor space for the community, biodiversity, and then also creating more water resilience overall through that increased supply. So when we think about co-benefits and the trade-offs, one of the key things is looking at a holistic approach. A more objective basis just means a more holistic approach, that not everything, it's a little bit of an art and science because you're putting a value on biodiversity, a value on flood mitigation for people to get to work, kids to get to school. And so really understanding what that means. So the other thing when we talk about benefits of co-benefits, making the most out of everything, the sustainability and optimizing that for the time, money, and resources. When you have processes that look at the adoption of water recycling strategies and they are community informed, there's buy-in and they are more likely to be supported. And those, when looking for funding to support those, they are more likely to come along with community support. One thing that's, I think, really compelling, because every strategy costs money, is the idea of where does that funding come from? When we think about co-funding and the opportunities to share costs, an example of reuse, stormwater capture and reuse even might be if you're looking at erosion control. And so you're working with the Department of Transportation, you're capturing stormwater, so you decrease erosion and increase a higher quality of water in streams and rivers. You can look at who the beneficiaries are and their saved costs. So looking at, for example, in this case, the transportation district. And so sharing those costs because they benefit from them as well. You can also look at how reuse, stormwater capture and use contribute to safer, greener environments. What is the role of Parks and Rec in that? Can there be shared costs across those departments? Air quality, disaster planning, and so on. The building community support through that multiple benefit lens is really important as well. And goes directly to the sustainability and the ownership of that project and the ability to show buy-in and a more compelling case for funding. I will say there are multiple funders, including federal funders, that the scoring and prioritization of projects is based on the demonstration of community buy-in, engagement, and support. So that actually is a really core element to demonstrate the need and viability of your project in relation to the community that you are seeking to serve. And so this just, again, kind of underscores the rest of those elements. I get excited about a lot of the topics, and I'm going to pick up the pace just a little bit here because I think I'm taking a little bit longer than I sometimes want to. So there are some great resources across the United States that can really help support the uptake and adoption of water reuse. And in water reuse, I'm going to mean broadly stormwater capture and reuse, gray water, decentralized, centralized reuse, all of those things. And there are a number of different sectors that actually you can break reuse down into. So everything from your industrial, your commercial, and so some of the leaders in this space might be like PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Danone, looking for how their kind of ESG goals, right? And how are they going to meet those and be corporate stewards of water? And so that is really a great example in which we can have public-private partnerships that advance water reuse and also help individual companies meet their ESG goals. We've talked about stormwater quite a bit, and we've hit on agriculture. So I'll go over to here. Potable reuse, actually, we're seeing more and more of, and it's been talked about for years now. Colorado was the first state in the country to have regs on the books for this, and Texas is a leader in potable reuse, kind of more case by case basis. But this is something that we are seeing expanding across the country, and as there's greater interest. I will say, as you think about the advancement of policy, sometimes I hear from utilities and partners that they're just kind of jumping straight ahead to potable reuse, and it helps them kind of reduce the amount of infrastructure. Sure, there's more treatment, but kind of you don't need a separate line for non-potable and then a separate system for potable. So sometimes that is attractive. I would also say, not every end use requires potable reuse, and that can potentially be prohibitive. And there are a number of communities that I know that are smaller that are not pursuing potable reuse for reasons that they don't align with the resources and end uses of that community. So with reuse, like every other type of alternative water development strategies, it really is context matters, and really thinking about the best approach that works for the end use. And then, of course, I talked about wetlands, which is an example of uses that benefit the environment. I'm happy to go into any of these later on. They're all pretty striking. So when we look big picture, how can Minnesota and their role in reuse kind of fit into this, bump up these numbers? So you can see that across the country, there are so many different ways in which water reuse is conserving water, stretching water, creating greater efficiency, decreasing pressures on potable water supplies, and helping to mitigate adverse impacts from nutrients. So, I use this. I also took this slide from the Water Reuse Association because I really love that these are kind of some big picture numbers of the impact that reuse can make within a region. And my question is, and meant to be, inspirational, but what can Minnesota do? Where can you fit? How can you advance reuse to so that you can optimize every single drop of water that you have for the best, greatest, highest use. And so often when we see those things reuse optimized, it actually is through partnership and collaboration. And so I wanted to highlight, this is a project that I worked on, and you see some of my other amazing colleagues who worked on this. But what we did was we looked across the country and we said, who is working on reuse in such a way that they are scaling reuse beyond that local footprint, right? And they're actually looking at the watershed scale, the sometimes even broader state scale, and looking at partnerships that help, again, optimize every drop of water through the adoption of reuse. And so some of the big picture things that we learned, and as I go through these, I'd love for you to kind of put your own lens on and think about how they apply to your work. But so some of the key lessons learned included that sometimes collaboration was slow to get off the ground because an agency or utility's mission do not necessarily automatically align with the scaling of reuse, or you could even say climate change, right? So many utilities and were founded because of, let's say, like a flood of record or something like that, that existed way before climate change became part of our vocabulary. And so rethinking how your mission can be applied for overall water resilience in a way that is aligns kind of with the founding intention, but also recognizes that, we've shifted over time. And now, like with being in a stage of permanent whitewater, we always have to be thinking about resilience and nimbleness and how we can adapt and to meet the conditions that are put before us. One of our big lessons learned, we had a former regulator that was part of our team, Felicia Marcus, and she really emphasized that if we want to advance reuse and policy, engaging with regulators early and often is so core to our end goals of advancing reuse and water resilience. She would often say, like, well, regulators are people too. But the thing is, regulators can be our allies in the advancement of water resilience and really help us think through ways to maybe even broaden some of our initial goals to be more encompassing or add more growth or room for kind of the development of regulations or the expansion of regulations in the future. One thing actually that was highlighted, and I'll bring it up a little bit later with Hampton Roads Sanitation District with their SWIFT program, and something that Felicia talked about that they also did in California, was that sometimes when regulators were part of that conversation from the beginning, there was actually more wiggle room in some of the development of water reuse. In this case, it would be water reuse strategies and policies, because they took longer. So certain compliance elements, while they were important, they could be met and even exceeded if a little more time was given for this broader, greater strategy that would have multiple benefits, and increase, say, the amount of water that could go to manage aquifer recharge or something like that. The economic analysis, essentially, it boiled, there were so many elements. What we're talking about here, though, is that when we're considering reuse at the local municipal watershed scale, it needs to stay manageable, but also if you can bring it out to that watershed scale and what collaboration looks like, you can really achieve greater economies of scope and economies of scale. Essentially meaning that if you go beyond the footprint of one utility considering reuse, and you look at other end users or wastewater entities within the region, when you plan together, you can accomplish more, and you can fit more under that one umbrella. It might be more expensive, but per drop of water, per acre foot of water, it is less expensive. And so therefore you have that economies of scale. So something to really think about is the role of regional collaboration and advancing reuse. And then, one piece here, you may have heard this phrasing before, but that partnerships or, things advance with the speed of trust. And what I would say is that is so true. There's an adage like the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, because you're really wanting that canopy and the fruits of that activity here, collaboration, working with those your water practitioner colleagues can builds that foundation, and it creates the opportunity to start working on projects at smaller scales together, so that when opportunities come to work at that larger regional or watershed scale, you have the relationships and you understand the governance perhaps of each entity and how you're able to move things so that you are able to work together. And then the final lesson learned is that for each of you representing organizations, whether utilities, agencies, NGOs, community benefit or community-based organizations, the last one's really geared towards utilities, but at the same time, it's true with any organization, you can serve your intended audience, and you can even do that better by understanding those long-term goals and the role that collaboration and partnership can provide to be even more effective at that. And so we can talk more about that later, but that came up over and over again. So I'm going to talk about two different examples here, one in your backyard and Twin Cities. I love this example so much. And I think that many of you may already know about this example, but even as we seek to really advance water reuse, that there are some really integrated models that are kind of smaller examples that can be key elements can be replicated and scaled. So this is a really great example. BART Engineering was the engineering firm before that behind this, and they worked with the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization, and we're two of the key partners in creating the Towerside Innovation District. So, I mean, this is like is just a dreamy project. So I get a little excited about this. So we're looking at stormwater capture and reuse, on-site reuse. We're looking at the treatment, the capturing of those waters, the treatment of that water that is used to support an urban garden on site. Also, there are stormwater management green features on the site. This also goes into the affordability when we think about the social determinants of health. The cost to do this and recapture and use existing water supplies brought down the cost of the water such that it's able to pay for the operations and maintenance of that system. And there are some complexities behind that, which I can't accurately really delve into, but that is correct big picture. The other piece that was so thoughtful that's included in this is that it is directly connected to public transportation. So there are so many different elements here that when we think about the social determinants of health and the role that water and water supply planning, reuse of on-site, as well as stormwater capture and reuse can really help advance a thriving community, an equitable community. I wanted to highlight also the SWIFT program. It's a Sustainable Water Initiative for Tomorrow. It's a pretty amazing program out of Hampton Roads Sanitation District in Virginia. And really, this project is so layered and amazing in what it's able to do One of the big picture goals of this, there are two really, is looking at nutrient management and then also looking at aquifer recharge to ensure long-term reliable water, drinking water supplies. And so there are a number of elements in this that ultimately led to those two outcomes. Um, Regulators were involved with this project from the very beginning. And actually, I will say there was a there was an overarching kind of review panel that was assigned to work on this that included water quality experts and really looked at, is this something that is sustainable and safe for the state of Virginia and our future drinking water supplies. So I just want to highlight this because you're looking at water quality, water quantity, water access, policy change. It's a beautiful example also of advancing reuse through policy, through collaboration. And I'm going to ask for let's wrap up a couple here. Looking at the trade-offs for stormwater capture and use, we've talked about these things, but really thinking about everything we have talked about, there are multiple benefit outcomes for reuse. And this is stormwater capture and use taken from that Pure Potential report, which I do so love. But really thinking about, when we think about the reuse of water, what are some of the things that we can think about at the local, regional scale that can also be positively impacted? What can stormwater capture and use in this case help make happen that may not otherwise be able to happen, or we may not be able to happen as easily? And this is an example of some of those outcomes. So as we close out, I'm gonna just, I wanna make sure we leave some time for some questions, but I wanted to highlight this, that as we're wrapping up here and we're thinking about paradigm shifts, the founder of the Pacific Institute, Peter Click, wrote a book called The 3 Ages of Water. And there's part of the prehistory that was written on tablets. And I love this so much because I feel like things come full circle. But there used to be serious consequences for not being, responsible stewards of your water supply. And so this is the only slide I ever read word for word, but it says, tablets recovered from the time of the Hammurabi also offer some insight into the development of institutions and rules for managing water resources for irrigation. The same tablet indicates that the owner of a field can petition the city authorities to flog a neighbor who fails to cooperate in harnessing surface waters for irrigation. Anyway, I just think that's really funny. And I can't see you because I'm presenting, but I hope, that gave some of you a good laugh about that. Let's see here. So with that, actually, this is kind of more getting into this. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint at the end with Michelle, and she can, if you keep this and, distribute it or however that looks, and you can go through. But these are some really nice kind of visuals that talk about the values of stormwater capture and use, systems and benefits. And actually, I want to wrap up as part of this. This is the image of Jackson Elementary that I was talking about when we look at multiple benefits on site and what does it mean to the community at hand. So stormwater capture and use at this site and enabled while they removed the pavement, they reduced the urban heat island effect, they planted trees, they created outdoor classroom spaces, and they created an urban green environment that benefits a community that does not have a lot of outdoor space. So real hands-on benefits that again contribute to public health and advanced quality education, one of the social determinants of health. And with that, I will wrap it up and leave you with this. Dennis Falls from Dallas Water Utilities, a friend and colleague, was part of an earlier project. And this is kind of your rallying cry for working together to advance reuse. But the idea that when you ultimately do come together and you create agreements, it's because there's a foundation of trust, of working together. And the legal agreements are codifying that, and in a way, a legal celebration of those relationships and a commitment to advance water resilience. So with that, thank you so much, and I'll turn it back over to Michelle.
Awesome. Thank you, Shannon, and thank you everybody for submitting questions. We do have about 10 minutes for questions. I see some of them online already. But let's use Shannon's expertise while she's here to talk more about the things you're curious about. So keep the questions coming and I'll read a couple of them as we go.
Stop screen sharing, Michelle.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
There we are. Okay. Now you just get to stare at our faces. All right. A few questions. We have one from Dave Luthi talking about it with historical development of lands. There's not a lot of land available for holding water, you know, especially in times of flood for reuse strategies. Do you have any suggestions for storage and how we can incorporate either land for conservation or things like that you've seen in other places?
Yeah, I actually would point to New York City as being a really great example. Actually, I'd say because of the land use and the age of the city, they really look more to on-site reuse than more, greater kind of centralized. Just imagine how much it would take to really dig in and do that. But I would say they also there's a process going on right now, and I can look it up, but I want to say it's called Rain Ready New York. And they actually have been actively planning on how to be regionally rain ready. But I will say they are one of the leaders for on-site reuse, with the recognition that there's not a lot of land for holding. And so other pieces of that would be that they do work closely with the regulators at the city to look at the benefits and credits and the things that developers, private entities can actually benefit from when they do put in systems that capture, collect, and treat stormwater or on-site wastewater before reusing.
Awesome. Alyssa's ready with the links. I see she's putting them in the
Yeah, that's
chat
great.
too.
I saw that pop up. Thank you.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
the community engagement piece, I love, and I think it's so important. And I want to see the buy-in and really ownership of these programs by the community. So I think that's part of, and a really key part of sustainability. So, yeah.
Maybe I'll go to our next question. I'm sure you anticipate this one, funding. A lot of times these projects are maybe a little bit more expensive than status quo, even though they have long-term benefits. And this maybe goes with the earlier question of funding land for conservation. But do you have suggestions on funding sources for different reuse projects where it's stormwater, wastewater, industrial? What are the different kinds of funding buckets you've seen?
So there are a number of different funding buckets at the state level in Minnesota. So in Colorado, we do have a state funding mechanism through our Colorado Water Plan, and funding is set aside to develop strategies that match the goals of the Colorado Water Plan. And I'm not sure if Minnesota has something like that directly aligns with your state goals, but that would be something I would point to. I would say big picture, I would go back to the multiple benefits element as well. If you are able to look at the number of ways in which the development of reuse or stormwater capture and use benefit the community. So in this case, let's go back to Jackson Elementary. Co-funding becomes a very viable mechanism, right? So you can look at Parks and Rec. In this case, you have the school district. You can look at the transportation department. There's so many ways that reuse can be included there. Also, there are a number of federal programs that support reuse. WIFIA does, Water Smart funds reuse. Those are some bigger lifts, of course, and some of them like require pre-qualification. But that's another way. And I would also say your state revolving funds can also cover your reuse or stormwater capture and use as well.
Great. Great answers. I'm going to keep reading down the list of questions. We have a few more minutes still. This one specifically of the SWIFT program.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you know all the details for that, but there's a question about how did they consider contaminants of emerging concern in treatment before aquifer recharge and storage? Do you know how they looked at that or how they addressed those risks?
So I can tell you what I know. I cannot with accuracy go down that road. I can point you to people who who are part of SWIFT and have been core to that program from the beginning. What I will say is in addressing the potential, in wanting to ensure an appropriate water quality that would eventually be drinking water. When the state legislator pulled together the oversight committee that I referenced earlier, on that committee was a person from the Virginia Department, I want to say of Health or Public Health. I can't quite remember the exact name, but she was not the person who actually regulated that. It was someone from environmental quality that was regulating, but as part of a broader understanding at the state level as to the risks and water quality considerations for this program, it was important that someone from public health was part of that oversight committee. So it was a very, I would say, like tactical placement of those committee members to make sure that there was someone on the oversight committee who understood water treatment, risk, public health, and those potential outcomes. So that is kind of that policy piece behind that. And I can point to others, and connect you with someone from SWIFT to answer more of the specific treatment questions. But what I just highlighted there, I always struck me as just wise, right? Because you want to make sure that at the end of the day, when that decision is made, that you have well-informed officials that understand that big picture from their different lenses that they bring to the table.
Yeah. And I think, that I've read about that and talked to people about the SWIFT project. And I think it's interesting too, because that was new for them as a state too. It's not like they'd done this thing before. So that's
Okay.
how they tackled learning about it together.
Yeah. And that was a
Um,
committee like that was created for that, so, due diligence through and through, just putting those different pieces in place.
yeah. There's another question about agricultural reuse. Have you seen reuse as example for like runoff from barns for animal drinking water? Have you seen that in other places across the country?
I know there are a number of examples for reuse. I want to say like in Colorado, I think it's going to be I get this wrong. I think it's 85 looks at that for on-site agricultural reuse for that. And it's more in the dairy portion, looking at water usage there. Yeah, I would say I don't know reuse regs across the nation like the back of my hand, but they do, it's interesting. And I'll point you to that Reuse Explorer actually, because the Reuse Explorer was Action 2.1 and Action 3.1 looked at regulations, policy, and then kind of fit for purpose requirements around microbial and chemical requirements for end uses. They vary state by state, and you can see some states that are just have different levels that, that some perceive as, well, that's a really low threshold, and others perceive as like, wow, that's an incredibly high threshold. And it varies they're human created, right? So think of the people who are behind those, creating those, and what their concerns might be for a specific region, and that's how they're informed. But yeah, thank you. I see Alyssa just put the Reuse Explorer there. It's fabulous. It really is. It's not 100% up to date, but it is pretty close to being there. And so that might just be something that you can look at across the United States, how, yeah, different regulations for reuse in ag.
Thank you. Um, there was one question too from Harvey, or I guess a comment that, really we've been doing reuse for a long time, especially with wastewater discharges along the river. We maybe don't talk about that
Definitely.
enough.
No, no, and all water is recycled, right? I mean, really, like what I actually love about reuse as institutionalized is that it can be treated the right purpose, the right water for the right use, right? Fit for purpose. So we actually really get to have a hand in being even, you know, as fine tune it as much as we need to for that end use. So the technology is there, the skill sets are there. Um, it's just I would say the public and the adoption side sometimes is more of a challenge to get there. But yeah, there are great examples of water being being appropriately treated for the intended end uses.
I like it. So we're getting to the end of the program. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you to Shannon for all her insights. We will be sending this around for the recording, and we can send Shannon slides around if you'd like them, and we'll put those up on our website in the next day or two. Hopefully it's inspired you to think a little bit more about circular water, resiliency, recharge, reuse. I heard a lot today about stacked benefits, about matching the use and the source to the fit and trying to make that fit for purpose. I think we're all cognizant that reuse isn't the one size fits all, but it can be a really great tool in certain sites and for certain projects. And any other closing thoughts, Shannon? We really appreciate this in Minnesota, and I love that you called out, how can Minnesota be a leader in this? We are the land of 10,000 lakes. We're the headwaters of the Mississippi, and I think we do have a responsibility to show sustainable water use and model that leadership across the country.
And thank you for having me here. For me, it's really important to make a difference, and I hope that I've provided some ways that each of you can see yourself making a difference. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody. And if you like this webinar, consider donating to Freshwater. We're a nonprofit that runs on foundation funding from you all as members and sponsors. So thank you all. Thank you to the College of Biological Sciences. And we will talk to you later. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks.